I guess that's what I think people with younger kids are probably hoping to hear, right? Is that it does get easier. It will come back. You will have more time.
It definitely gets easier. It absolutely gets easier.
Welcome to Artists in Offices, a podcast that explores, through interviews with working artists, the idea that the work you do for pay supports the work you do for love. I'm your host, Rebecca Bird Grigsby, visual artist, mom of two, and full-time project manager by day. In 2017, I left my day job at the time and spent 2 years rebooting my studio practice while navigating the uncertain terrain between day jobs and creative work. In season 1, each episode offered a conversation with an artist balancing their day job with their art practice. This season, I'm stepping outside of the office to talk with artists who are also parents, creative people at different stages of their careers and caregiving about what it really takes to make art while raising kids. On this episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Ellen Lake to the podcast. Ellen is an interdisciplinary artist based in Oakland whose work spans painting, video, sculpture, installation, and public art. She often experiments with technology and archives, creating projects that blur the boundaries between process and material. Her public art initiative, Bench Projects, replaced ads with art by local artists at AC Transit bus stops in North Oakland. Ellen has been awarded residencies at places like Mass MoCA, the Vermont Studio Center, the Rauschenberg Residency, and Stanford's Experimental Media Arts Lab, and she's received grants from the California Arts Council and the City of Oakland. She's also the co-executive director of Kala Art Institute, a residency program and community art hub in Berkeley. At home, Ellen is just as dynamic. She lives with her husband, their 3 children, and 2 chihuahuas, Max and George. Ellen Lake, welcome to Artists in Offices. I'm going to just jump right into our questions. So I understand that you worked for about a decade as a social worker before you went to Mills College here in Oakland to get your MFA. But I think I read or heard in another interview that you were painting during this time. So can you talk about that period of your life and your transition to going back to school for art?
Absolutely. And thanks, Becky, for having me. Let's see, you're taking me back a bit. I moved to California in 1995, and I was working for the Berkeley Food and Housing Project, which I was working doing homeless services. And that was following up on work I did in Vermont that was similar to that. And I would take painting and drawing classes at community college, a ceramics class at community college. And then when I moved to Berkeley, I continued that. I worked at the food project as a case manager, and then I would take painting and drawing classes through UC Extension primarily. And then I came to a crossroads right before I was 30, where I was thinking, do I want to get an MSW, which is the Masters of Social Work, or do I want to really focus on art and get an MFA? And I chose the route of getting an MFA. And I went to Mills College in Oakland. All right.
Yeah. So
Mills.
For your undergrad, did you study, what did you study? Like, were you doing art at that time, or was it more kind of social work adjacent?
Yeah, I actually studied Chinese language and history, and I spent a semester in Nanjing, and I studied for many years and really never learned to read the newspaper. And so I decided to move on to other interests. And in college, I took a printmaking class and kind of like an intro to art class. And I always really liked art. I just didn't know that I wanted to focus on art.
Yeah. So was art something you did like as a kid and teenager?
Yeah, I did it. I did it throughout my life. I like to draw as a kid. And then in high school, I took an art class that I remember very clearly with an art teacher named Percy Martin. And I remember making a giant paper mache popsicle with my friend Andrea Otteson. So sort of smaller experiences throughout my life. And the big shift was heading to Mills in the year 2000 to just completely go all in, immersive into the art world.
Yeah. So was there anything in that, when you were taking classes in Berkeley that like why MFA, like why Mills?
Right. That's a good question. I actually looked at CCA at the time and some other art schools. And I remember Stephen Goldstein at CCA saying, have you looked at Mills yet? It's a really small program, and I think you might really like it. And so when I went to the campus, I think there was 10 to 12 people in each MFA class, and you have studios right next to the Mills College Art Museum. It's kind of a refuge in the Laurel District in Oakland. And I fell in love with it immediately. There's a giant outside pool to swim in, a really great environment for making art, small faculty. And I had 9 other classmates my year in my MFA program, who I'm still really close with today.
Yeah. So can you talk more about your experience there at Mills, to your
Yeah.
program at the time, right?
Yep, to your program. I went in doing painting and drawing. And as soon as I got there, I immediately started taking film and video classes. I took a really great electronic arts class with Gail White, where we were taking apart toys and learning how to use motors and learning how to solder things together and reanimating objects. And so I was immediately fell in love with that process and started working. I moved from painting and drawing to sculpture and installation and film and video. And I had a housemate at the time in Berkeley named Ian Golder, who had a generic macaroni and cheese box collection and all sorts of eclectic collections. And so I did my very first documentary called Ian's Collections about his very interesting collections. And that led me down a path for about a decade of shooting short documentary films about eclectic collectors and their unusual collections. And so I would just think that I'm finished when somebody would say, "Oh, have you met my friend who has a fire hydrant collection? Oh, have you met my friend who has a toothbrush collection? Oh, have you met my friend who has a French fry collection?" So I felt like I could have just gone on and on for that. But it was a really fun film and video project that spanned many, many years. Yeah, good. I just really loved the faculty. I really loved taking classes with Gail White. I really appreciated getting to know Hung Lu there. And then after I graduated from Mills, I became her studio assistant in Oakland, and I worked for Hung Lu, and I worked for her husband, Jeff Kelly, who was writing a book about Alan Capro and about happenings. And so I was doing a lot of photo permissions and working on that book with him. And I was just going to say that I really felt like Mills was a great environment to experiment across different media. And that's one of the things I loved best about it.
Yeah, well, that was actually going to be one of my next questions. Was after grad school, the work you did for Hung Lu and Jeff Kelly, who are actually a couple. I mean, Hung Lu obviously has passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but and so that seems like a pretty amazing day job to have been able to work with and for both of them. What other day jobs have you had over the years, especially as you kind of pivoted to focusing more on being an artist? Anything that stands out positively or negatively?
Yeah, absolutely. So after I graduated from Mills in 2002, I was looking for work, and I wasn't yet working for Hung Lu and Jeff Kelly. So I returned to my social work days, and I worked at a methadone clinic in Berkeley called Berkeley Addiction Treatment Services on Sacramento Street in Berkeley. And the hours for the methadone clinic are something like 5 a.m. to noon. And so I felt like that would be a good fit with being an artist, because I could work from 5 a.m. to noon, and then I could have some studio time. And so I did go back to work at the methadone clinic for a little while, I think a year or two. And then during that time, I got a phone call from Hung Lu, who I never actually took a class from her at Mills, but she said something like, "Oh, I saw you were a TA for Robin McDonald's, painting and drawing class. And I saw you setting up a still life early. And so it seemed to me you were a responsible person. Would you like to be my studio assistant?" And so that was a really nice phone call to get. And I said, sure. And so then I spent a couple of years, gessoing a lot of big canvases, and, update invoicing for her public art projects. And I really I began to learn about arts administration, I think, during that experience. Still worked at the methadone clinic, and those were my main jobs at the time.
Mm-hmm. And how did that schedule when you were at the methadone clinic, working kind of an early shift? Did that work out the way you thought it would? Were you able to do your art in the afternoon?
It was a little bit grueling. It was a really tough schedule. And then during that time, I had my first child. So things became complicated very quickly with how to juggle it all. Parenting, several part-time jobs, making art. So that was the beginning of having to juggle that.
Yeah, I bet. So you had and you have 3 kids, right?
I do.
So you had your first kid while you were kind of juggling everything. Did you kind of decide to let one thing go? And what did that period look like?
Well, the other part of just leaving grad school is you don't really have any money. So there's a fourth thing. So, so there's well, you kind of have to keep working. And so the way that I did it with my husband, he's a scientist, so we're not in the same field, is that he would do the early shift with Sam. We had Sam in 2003, and I would still go to the methadone clinic. And then I worked less hours for Hung Lu so I could spend more time with Sam. But Chris kind of did the morning shift, and then I would do the afternoon shift. And then when they were really small, you're still feeling kind of optimistic because you can carry them around and like take them to work sometimes. And all of that kind of falls apart as soon as they start moving around. But I remember each step was like a transition, like, oh, I can do this. I'll just bring them over here. I'll just bring them on this film shoot. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, these noises are impossible to edit out. So, I think it's a lot of just like pivoting and sort of trying to make it work. I can't remember when I quit my job at the methadone clinic, but eventually I was like, I just can't do this anymore. It could have been when I had my second kid, Josie. So they're 2 years apart. And I did notice that's like where the real shift happened, is like after having a second child, I dropped the methadone clinic job, did part-time work for Hung and Jeff, parenting. And the art practice then kind of goes up and down depending on the project.
Right. Of course. Yeah. And we'll talk more obviously about your kids as we get through the questions, but backing up a little bit, I did want to ask a little bit more about, when you were in grad school, you were inspired by one of your housemates, Ian, as you've already mentioned, and his various collections, and kind of made that very first video piece about him. And you've kind of collected this collection of collectors collecting things, right? So I had kind of two questions, because it's funny, watching a bunch of those videos on your Vimeo page. It just made me think of having kids, to be honest. And like, I'm not much of a collector, but like, I feel like my kids have had various collections over the years. So I'm wondering, like, did your kids have any collections growing up? And is it ongoing? Are you still making this work?
So many good questions in there. Okay, let's see. I had collections when I was a kid. I collected like pretty typical stuff like postcards and like different buttons. I think they're still in my parents' house in DC. So I collected like a lot of like little collections that I would spend time moving around and keeping track of. And so I was into that as a kid. And then I sort of didn't think about it until Ian was my housemate. And he, under his bed were all the New York Times that he hadn't finished reading. So that was one of his collections. And then my favorite collection was the generic macaroni and cheese box collection. I also really liked the straws with wrappers on, because now straws don't have wrappers. And so seeing all that ephemera was really interesting. His M&M icon collection. And I just had such a positive experience as my very first film and video project working with Ian. He was just delightful. He was playing his accordion and sharing, all the ways he curates and thinks about collecting. And so that led to another collection and another collection. But I started filming with a Hi8 camera. And then I moved to like a digital camcorder. But once like technology got so good and so easy, I think I even made one of the films in Super 8. It was Rebecca Barron's French fry collection. And she's a filmmaker. And she went on a film shoot in South Dakota or North Dakota. She would go to a restaurant, take an exemplary fry from the restaurant, a napkin from the restaurant, and basically just write like the name of the restaurant and the date, and put that along with the French fry into a Ziploc bag. And that was sealed away for years. And when she pulled them out, some were perfectly preserved, some were rotting. So some people's collections are very unusual. Anyway, so I did a Hi8, Super 8. And then once the iPhone videos got really good, I stopped shooting. Maybe I should get back to it.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Is it like, are you less interested in, like, maybe once the iPhone technology gets a little bit obsolete, it'll be more interesting to you?
Maybe. I really don't know, but there was something about when it was just a little bit more difficult to like, edit in Media 100 and, take out your tapes. I think I even had a Pixel Vision camera, so I was really interested in the ways technology changes over the years, and I'll be interested in the iPhone again, I'm sure. And at some point I found this old film in my grandmother's closet that was this 16 millimeter film from the 1930s. And that's a whole story in and of itself. But at the time it was like 2008, 2009, and I would juxtapose it with really clunky not iPhone, but a really clunky cell phone video from the time. And so I was interested when the image quality was like really pixelated with the early cell phones. And so that's been another thread that I've pursued, is sort of experimenting with the evolution of technology.
Yeah, and it's funny. I collected a lot as a kid, but I moved around a lot, so I got rid of some collections. And actually, just talked about this with the person I interviewed yesterday in terms of like things that we regret getting rid of and those transitions. But yeah, I had a shopping bag collection as a kid, and I put them on my ceiling. Which in hindsight, I sometimes I'm like, wow, that was so like consumerist of me. But I sort of regret getting rid of those at one point. So, but yeah, just to tie your kids into this, did they, did they have any interesting collections growing up?
I'm trying to think. I also like, what were those like little animals you could get at the beach? I feel like one of my kids inherited somebody's collection. So Ruby inherited somebody's collection that she was into. But my kids in general, they were very messy in their rooms. And I'm looking around, I'm in my daughter's room right now, but they weren't big collectors.
So this work, so you might return to this work. It sounds like you haven't worked on collections in a while, but I'm sure as I think with any artist, it's always in your back pocket, right? Like,
yeah, and
nothing's ever truly complete.
No, I'm always really interested in collecting and archiving. So those are topics that remain really interesting to me. And so if somebody has a really important collection for me to film, I'm happy to pick it up again.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and we'll touch on that later. I have a couple of questions about more recent work and some kind of through lines, I think. But kind of continuing with the chronology. So you did an artist talk at Kala Art Institute in 2008, where you work now as co-director. When did you start working there, and what has your professional journey there been like?
I was looking at Kala's fellowship residency program, and Kala is a great resource for artists. And the fellowship program, you can apply from anywhere in the world, and you receive $3,000, a 1 to 9 month artist residency at Kala, where you have 24/7 access to the equipment. And there's a big printmaking studio, black and white darkroom, a digital lab. Now there's a sculpture lab. At the time, there wasn't that. And then you have your cohort of artists, and you have a culminating exhibition. And so I thought that seemed like a really great idea. And so I was looking on the website at the fellowship program, hoping to apply. And then I saw that there was a development associate position. And I thought to myself, I'm more likely to get the job than the fellowship. I should apply for the job. And so I applied for the job without that much development experience. Development is grant writing and asking for donations. And so I had a little bit of experience as working for Hung Lu in terms of, doing a little bit of grant writing and research and arts administration there, but not much else, not much else development experience. And so I went to the interview and I listened for an hour, and I said about 3 sentences. And the development director at the time was really wonderful. And I felt really fortunate that she hired me. And so I started working at Kala in 2008, and we were working on a capital campaign then trying to raise $1 million. And so I just dove right into the world of fundraising and development, and learned a lot over the next 15 years, and sort of became eventually development director and then managing director. And now I'm co-executive director along with Mayumi Hamanaka, who has also been at Kala a long time. She started in 2006, so she was there before me. And we have had many different jobs there over the years. And so it feels kind of full circle, and a real honor to be a co-director along with Mayumi.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, to that point, I love how, looking at your Instagram, how integrated, your Kala posts are on your timeline. Like, it's clear your day job, your career is clearly so important to you. So how does your work there influence your more personal creative work, and vice versa?
I think one of the things that first attracted me to Kala Art Institute was the emphasis on kind of traditional image making techniques and new technology, and how those intersect and how they can work together. And it kind of fits in with my interest in sort of old film, working alongside new film, experimenting across media. And so that's the part of that part of Kala really drew me to Kala, keeps me engaged, and is something I love to see still happening there. Artists come in and they just experiment with so many different techniques in media, and they share ideas and share work and experiment with installation in the gallery. And so there's just all of these different facets to being an artist that can happen there. And I think one of my favorite parts is that CALA is a community that you can come back to over the course of your career. So you could come as an artist in resident and, go do a bunch of other things and 5 years later come back, or you could stay really involved in the community on a, daily, weekly basis. And so it's just a home base for artists to return to over time. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, it's kind of been a home base for me, and a place that I have felt really fortunate that I was able to raise my kids there, and they would come to Camp CALA, or they'd come to after school art, teen studio workshops. And so it really was integrated in my day-to-day, sort of my family coming through, and then being exposed and influenced by so many different kinds of artists coming from all over the world to make work at CALA has had a big impact on the way that I think about art in general. And so just lots of different layers of ways that it's influenced my life and practice.
Yeah. And so I think you had your first two kids. If I kind of get, I think I have a general sense of the dates. I believe your youngest daughter was probably born after you started working there. Were you part-time initially, or have you always been full-time there?
No, I started working as a development associate 16 hours a week. Mm-hmm. And so I had dropped the methadone clinic job. I was no longer working as Hung Lu's assistant, but I still worked for Jeff Kelly. So I had the job with Jeff. I had a part-time job at CALA, and then my kids in art practice. And so I'm trying to remember when I became full-time at CALA. I think eventually, in order to get benefits, you have to work something like 30 hours a week. Mm-hmm. And so after a few years, I moved from, 16 or 20 hours a week to full-time is considered anything over 30 there. Mm-hmm. But it's a very flexible place because so many people on staff are artists. It was started by two artists, Archana Horsting and Yuzo Nakano. It's a very artist-centered organization. And so the idea was that people would sort of max work 4 days a week so that people had time for an art practice or a studio day. And so that also works really well, I think, with parenting.
Yeah, that's awesome. Does that work out in practice? Or, I would imagine you both wear a lot of hats. It's a tiny but mighty staff. Are you able to actually get your work done in 4 days?
No, not really. It's really hard to get your work done in 4 days. So like many nonprofits, like you say, we all wear multiple hats there. And so kind of staff capacity is always an issue. And so it is very challenging to maintain a work-life balance because there's always more work to do. And especially when you're working in funding programs, funding artists, the main mission is to support artists over the long arc of their career. A big way that we do that is by getting money back into the pockets of artists through fellowships and artist residencies and artist commissions and, teaching opportunities. And so I feel very responsible for making sure that I'm raising the amount of money that I can to help the organization. And so it can be hard to balance, to really maintain a good work-life balance in that way.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the, I guess, kind of a good problem to have, but one of the downsides of having a day job that you really love, I would imagine, is that it's hard to, kind of, I don't know. I wonder is it ever a challenge, to kind of put to draw that boundary and say, because I find that there's this hierarchy and, it's sort of our, kids probably, and then, we got to make money. And then I find for me, the art, unfortunately, even when I try to, combat this, always kind of falls to the end. So, I would imagine if I had I'm not saying that I don't like my job, but if I had a job that I was super passionate about, that would be even more challenging. Is that true?
It has been challenging for me to make art the more responsibility I have at CALA. I think early on, because I was part-time, I was able to maintain a more active studio practice. And then I sort of just said, well, instead of a daily art practice, I'll just do project-based art practice. And then I feel like it's a slippery slope between, well, I'll just wait until I go on an artist residency to work on that. And so one of the strategies I've had over the years is making sure that I do artist residencies where I have a break from my day job, a break from family life. And I often just do 2 weeks because that especially when the kids were younger, was what I could handle and get away for was 2 weeks. But I feel like I'm working my way up to 3 weeks or a month. And I really love artist residencies as a place where I feel really creative, inspired, productive in a way that I find it really hard to do in day-to-day life.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to talk more about the residencies that you've done, but really quickly before we move on from Kala, can you talk a little bit more about, I know Kala has a parent artist residency program. Can you talk a little bit more about that program? And it's not new, but it's newer than the artist in resident, the broader program, right?
Right. So Kala has been around for 51 years, since the 70s. And then the fellowship program, which is the first program I talked about where we fund artists to come to Kala, started in the 80s. And I got to Kala in 2008. And the parent artist residency program started around 2012 with funding from Sustainable Arts Foundation. And the first year we funded 10 parent artists to come to Kala, and the parents got $1,000 of custom tailored kind of Kala services to choose from. And I thought in my head, well, artists might want to come in the summer and, put their child in Camp Kala and then they could work in the studio. But it was really completely up to the individual parent artist. And it turned out that most people, preferred instead to take an art class and 2 months of an artist residency. And only occasionally did people put their child in a program while they were working at Kala, but some people did do that. So the idea was to be like really flexible and meet each different family where they're at, knowing that people need very different things as parents, depending on the age of your children, how many children you have, what kind of a family structure you have. But it was very inspiring to bring that first year 10 parent artists to Kala, and some of whom returned as artists in residence, some of whom, sell artwork through the art sales program at Kala and have continued to be involved. And then for 10 years, we had different iterations of the parent artist residency program through Sustainable Arts Foundation. And then the last couple of years, they switched their funding priorities. And so we're in the process of looking for new funding so that we continue to fund the parent artist residency program. It was one that was really important to me and just provided a lot of access for some people who were getting back into making art after having taken a break. And it was a really nice bridge for parent artists like that. Other people who just needed a little extra support or a boost to, finish a project or to feel supported and to finish a project. So that's a program that's really special to me.
Yeah, definitely. So it sounds like you've been able to, like, has there been an interruption in that program or?
Only recently.
Okay.
The current funding landscape now is like amongst the trickiest I've seen since I've worked in nonprofit arts organizations. So just given the politics, and then it's really difficult. Federal funding, NEA, loss of NEA funding. A lot of different foundations have shifted priorities or cut funding. And so it's turning out to be a challenging time for grant writing.
Yeah. I think locally as well. I mean, I know in the city of Oakland, we're kind of in the thick of that right now, looking at budget cuts across all sorts of city services. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like arts and culture is vital, really important, completely smart to fund. And I know there's a lot of great advocacy happening. So I'm hoping that this phase doesn't last for too long.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about your kids. So, and you've talked a little bit, but can you talk more about how your creative practice has evolved over the years, as they've grown? I mean, your kids are, I think you have 2 are adults and 1, I believe, is still at home. Is that correct?
Yes. So I have, my youngest is Ruby. She's 15 and she's going to be a sophomore at Oakland Tech. And then Josie and Sam are both currently in college, 21 and 19 years old. So 2 almost launched, and one was a fair amount of high school to go.
Yeah.
But they've very much inspired my art practice. I think one of my favorite examples is we have benches in our neighborhood that often read "advertise here." And for 10 years, I would tell them I was going to do an art project with the benches. Oh, there's such great public art galleries. We could have, local artists put their artwork on. And I kept talking about it and doing nothing about it. And then finally, one of my kids was like, I don't think you're ever going to do anything with the benches, which was just the motivation I needed to apply for City of Oakland cultural funding grant. I think was where I got started, or Southern Exposure's Southern Exposure's alternative exposure grant. I got, one initial grant of like $5,000, and then I was able to keep this bench projects going for, almost 5 years. Where when it started, we took 4 of the AC Transit bus benches, and we paid for the advertising, but put artwork on it by local North Oakland artists. And at some point we had funding for like 10 benches. So they were along MLK in North Oakland, along Shattuck, along Market Street. And it was so fun because there's so many artists in North Oakland. And, we would switch out the benches every few months. And it was just really a great way to bring the community together, and anyone could enjoy them. If you were walking, biking, on the bus, it was a great way to turn just, a sign that always read "advertise here" into art. I didn't want to be an example of just always talking about something and dreaming and not doing it. Like, I think it's great to have dreams. I think it's great to have ideas. I don't think you have to do every single one of them. But if I was going to talk about this idea of the bus bench galleries, year after year and still not do anything, it was that comment that was like, "You're never going to do this, Mom." And I really didn't, I really took that and I was like, oh, I really do want to do this. Like, I want to find the funding so I can do this. Yeah, my kids definitely inspired me there. They're all really creative. They all really like to draw. They like to paint. My middle daughter and her friend started a summer arts and crafts camp called Camp Watermelon 7 years ago. And then
yeah,
which is really fun.
I've seen it on your Instagram, but I didn't quite understand what it was. So that's cool. It's good to know.
So they do, it's like for, local kids, they do arts and crafts and a play. So they do like, cardboard set design, and a lot of projects like making soap, making candles, tie-dyes, weaving. And so they've done that for 7 summers. And then when Josie kind of graduated and went to college, she passed it along to Ruby and her friend. And this summer was their second summer running Camp Watermelon. And so it's really fun.
That's so cool. Yeah.
To see them doing those kinds of creative projects.
Yeah. So speaking of the bench project, I have to say, when I was starting my research, I mean, we've followed each other for a few years, but I got I was still dug into all of your work, and I was so sort of like touched to see At Home on your CV. That's the sort of unofficial show that I sort of quote unquote curated in an empty house here in the Laurel back in, was that December 2023? I think it feels like it was just last year, but I think it was actually a year and a half ago. And I just remember, reaching out to folks and being so sort of surprised and grateful that you replied and you were like, yeah, sounds great. Let's do it. That you seem really open to showing your work in kind of unconventional ways. And obviously with the bench project, I think kind of looking at kind of untapped spaces. So are there I guess I'm curious to just hear more about how you approached that project. Like, did you reach out to artists you knew? I'm actually speaking with Lisa Solomon later in this series, so that's exciting. And what other public spaces would you like to see activated by local artists in a similar or different way?
Yeah, I loved your show At Home. I thought it was such a brilliant concept. And it is one of my favorite ways to show art is in underutilized or overlooked spaces. And so I really appreciated when you brought us together for that. And then, I also like art that's outside because anyone can enjoy it. Even if there's lots of free art spaces to go to, some people just aren't as used to or aren't as comfortable in kind of crossing the threshold and going into those spaces. And so I'm always really interested in the idea of having that art or that experience be on the sidewalk or the street, or like you say, in overlooked or discarded or underutilized spaces. I love when people do projects on buses or on public transportation. I like when there's really good art in the airport or at BART or, totally. All of that. Yeah, I'm the same way. I love a rogue projection that happens. I always like looking up and at what is it, Salesforce, and seeing what's up there if I'm driving over the Bay Bridge. And so I think I do appreciate any kind of pop-up or unexpected art in public places. I have my eye on a couple of spaces in and around the building that Kala is located in. I keep seeing spaces that I think, oh, that would be perfect for large scale temporary public art. But I haven't approached the landlord yet.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, there's a little space. I don't know if you ever go to the Trader Joe's near Lakeshore, the parking lot. If you're exiting out kind of the back, I don't know if you've noticed this, but if not, look to your right as you're exiting next time. And it's not art, it's gardening. Basically, like they have taken over just this little like tiered plot, kind of I just tucked away, and they've planted all sorts of things. So I love the surprise element too. And I think for me, like I've never seen I never saw the benches. I wish I had known about them at the time, because I think that's also really great to kind of expose kids. Like it's just so easy, right? Like you just go and you see it and kind of show them that like art is just part of, our everyday lives and routines. I know there's a couple of places that, like, especially during the pandemic with younger, kids were younger at the time, like the Roll Up Project in Oakland was a nice space that we would just make kind of an outing of it. Are there any other spaces like that you're aware of or that have kind of stood out over the years with, your kids?
I love the Roll Up Project. I'm glad you brought that one up. That's an amazing space. And I always like the artists that are shown there.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So that's a great space. I have to think about that one. I was going to sort of get back to the question of how I selected the artists for the bench projects, if that's okay. And then
yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yes.
So when thinking about when we first got a grant for bench projects, I first went to my immediate block on 56th Street between Shattuck and MLK. And I just thought, how many artists are on this block? I want to start so local, like micro, And so on my block, there was like 8 artists. And so I just started with artists on my block.
Okay.
And then I sort of went out from there in North Oakland. Oh, this artist lives, 3 blocks away or 5 blocks away. But I tried to keep it so that the artists were like within walking distance from the benches. And I think that was true for most of the project. It was like Kelly Ording and Jet Martinez and Lisa Solomon, who I'm so excited that you're going to interview. My next door neighbor, Ronnie Sampson, and down the street, Zahida Levy and Andrea Brewster. I mean, all of these wonderful artists, Lynn Beldner and Steve Briscoe, just lived right around here. And I would give them the dimensions and they'd send different artwork, and it was a really great experience. I'm trying to think of other really good public art projects. I always like the ones that Foresight does.
Oh, yes. Love that. Near Fort Mason.
Yeah. Those are great projects, I think.
I think there's something for me about seeing work behind glass, because I'm thinking of the Kala has like a window, the Berkeley. Yeah. Yeah, which has kind of a similar thing where you just walk by and you're like, oh, this is somebody's art. And you're just like, I'm usually like walking with one of my kids and I'm like, hey, look at this. How cool.
Yeah,
so
I love
kind of surprise element. Yeah.
I love that space in downtown Berkeley. It's Milvia and Addison. We put like one artist doing an installation up for 6 months time. And it's in a storefront or a window of a business right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of makes me, and then I walk by all these vacant storefronts throughout Oakland. I'm sure, I know a lot of cities are dealing with this, and I'm like, I just want to see artists work in like all of these windows, such untapped space.
Completely agree with you.
Yeah.
100%.
So you mentioned with the bench project too, like I think taking art out of kind of a traditional, white box gallery setting. I think you said something similar too about like your experience with, I think it was on the Spoiler Alert podcast interview that you did ages ago, but about your documentary films, about kind of being able to show your work to different kinds of audiences. Can you talk more about that? Because I feel like I see that as kind of a through line as well in your work.
Yeah. I just haven't been somebody who's traditionally shown work in a lot of gallery spaces. So I have been more drawn towards non-traditional, or maybe more accessible kinds of spaces. I'm really excited to have a show in September at a space called Le Shed in Santa Rosa.
Oh, nice. Awesome.
Which is another one of those kind of pop-up art spaces. I think, it partly feels like you have permission to be experimental. You don't necessarily have to make work with a price tag on it to sell. So I really appreciate both of those things. And part of the reason I really enjoyed working with film and video in that way is, you could kind of just create something and put it online or send it somewhere to be projected. It was like easy to distribute. Kala is really well known for printmaking. I guess you could think about printmaking and multiples in the same way. Kind of each print might not be precious, or in some case they are more precious, but often there's a way that print can be about getting out a message or making so many copies and putting them up in public space. And if somebody rips it down, oh, well, at least that's one aspect of printmaking. And so that is something I'm interested in, whether it's, media, film and video, or print, or temporary public art, is sort of this non-precious element to it, and permission to really be experimental. I think my show in September is going to be called Test Kitchen, along those lines. Like, I really like the idea of just testing something out and seeing what sticks or what engages people.
Yeah, totally. So as your kids have gotten older, and maybe this is coincidence, but it does seem like I've like looking at your CV and following you on Instagram for the past few years that you have done more residencies. It seems like one a year, maybe at least one a year over the past maybe 3 or 4 years. So can you talk more about the you mentioned residencies before, and then of course we talked about the artist residency program at Kalak. So can you talk more about the residencies that you've done over the past few years and how they've allowed you to make work as a working parent?
Yeah. The first residency I went to was before having children. It was 1999, before grad school, and I went to the Vermont Studio Center. And then, after that, I didn't do another residency for 20 years.
Oh, wow.
Like you're saying, I really got caught up in life, and raising 3 children is really a lot of work. And I didn't feel I could go away. And then I had an opportunity in 2019. I saw an advertisement, like a open call for full-time artists working full-time at an artist residency program to apply to go to the Rauschenberg residency in Captiva, Florida. And I thought, oh, that's me. I'm a, artist working full-time at an artist residency program. It was a 2-week artist residency. I'm just going to apply. And so I applied and I got in, and it was a completely transformative experience, because then I'm with 9 other people who both share a passion for art making like I do, but also a day-to-day job as an arts administrator at an artist residency program. And so when I went there, there was, Harlan from the Vermont Studio Center, somebody else from the Clay Studio in Philadelphia, somebody else from Elsewhere, which is a residency program in a thrift shop in North Carolina. And so then all of a sudden, somebody from the Steel Yard in Providence, Rhode Island. And so my world just opened up, where I got to hear about all these other residency programs, and I got to know people who ran them or worked for them. Meantime, Rauschenberg residency is, where Robert Rauschenberg had his studio in Captiva, Florida. So it was completely beautiful. And I had a clay studio all to myself. So that's where I learned ceramics, and I fired 3 kilns. And so I began to sort of it's like just sparked that feeling of like, oh, I can just learn something completely new, and I can, spend 2 weeks immersed in it. And so that was the first time I'd really done a lot of ceramics. And so then I had such a positive experience there, and I went back just kind of feeling refreshed and, ready for my family and ready for work at Kala. And so I thought to myself, I'm going to try to do an artist residency every year, every other year at least. And that way you can go visit different parts of the country or the world, learn new techniques depending on what resources and equipment they have at the artist residency, and network as an artist. Like sometimes it can be a little bit lonely making artwork. And then all of a sudden, when you're sharing space with 5, 6, 8 other artists, you learn from their craft and practice. And, I just really love that networking experience too. And so then after the Rauschenberg residency, I went back to the Vermont Studio Center, and then I did a residency at Mass MoCA in North Adams, Massachusetts, which was really incredible. And then most recently one at Cowhouse Studios in Ireland, which was also a really rewarding experience.
Yeah, and you mentioned like doing ceramic work for the first time, and it does seem like obviously you did a lot of film and video work coming out of the MFA program, and for several years after. But more recently, it does seem like your creative output seems much more tactile, and it seems like you're kind of stacking and arranging like various three-dimensional pieces that you've made or found. But then I think at the Cowhouse Studios in Ireland, I also get the impression that like I wonder if you're collecting raw materials for future moving projects. And I think that Rolodex animation that you made there is such a cool and kind of exciting peek into this way of working. Can you talk a little bit more about where you're at creatively right now? And am I onto something there?
Yes, you are absolutely onto something. So the funny thing about the kind of what would you call it? Like you called it
I said roll. I thought it was a Rolodex, like where, back in the day where you would keep like addresses. I don't know. Maybe that's not what it was, but
yeah, it's kind of an early moving image crank machine, something scope.
Oh, okay. So it's not a roll because I was like, oh, you found a Rolodex and you somehow like printed the images and
yeah. So anyway, so I did become, you're absolutely right. So at my most recent artist residency, I started back with the moving image and I just started doing stop motion animation. I had a day with a studio to myself. Other than that, I shared a studio space. And so during my day, when it was just me in the studio, I started finding every kind of roll of tape I could find and stacking it up and doing stop motion animation that way. And every, book about a woman artist and stacking those up and cardboard and stacking that. And so really just beginning to get back into the flow of like working with moving image and stop motion animation. And then I think earlier we talked about sort of the interest in like, how technology evolves over the years. So you're right. I am going back to that when I was putting together this hand cranked animation of the stacked tape, the rolls of tape. And I do want to see like where that project goes, because I felt like it was just the beginning of a test about that. Like you could, again, I could go back to working with motors and you could motorize it, or you could keep those hand cranked. And so thinking about different ways to, stay in that tactile mode of building something with your hands. So kind of the handmade that I've been more interested in recently, but then returning to like, moving images and the handmade. So I think I'm trying to bring it together, and in the process of bringing it together, I just need another artist residency.
Yeah, definitely. So what are you looking at? So you have a show coming up in the fall, and then you just came back, right, a couple weeks ago from this residency. So are you just kind of starting to look now for what you might do next year?
Yeah, I'm starting to look at residencies for next year. So I went for 2 weeks in May to Cowhouse Studios, which is in Wexford County, Ireland. And it's such an interesting place. The people who started it, Frank and Rosie, went to San Francisco Art Institute around 2000. And that's where they met. And then they decided then that they wanted to return to Ireland, where she's from, and see if they could open a residency program on her family farm. And so they converted two sort of unused dairy barns into studio space and accommodations for artists, and started this artist program 20 years ago. And so I really, really enjoyed that experience. And so I think now, after I test out a few ideas for my show Test Kitchen in September at Le Shed, I will start applying for the next set of artist residencies. And I usually have to apply to like 5 or 6 to sort of have 1 or 2 opportunities. And so it's just, figuring out if I want to do another one internationally or if I want to stay closer to home. And if I can graduate to 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks to really finish some of these ideas.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like that's one, I guess aspect of parenthood is, as they get older, obviously it does, it continues to change. But I feel like it does free up time, or free up kind of mental energy or physical energy even. So that ebb and flow of parenthood and I guess that's what I think people with younger kids are probably hoping to hear, right? Is that it does get easier. It will come back. You will have more time.
It definitely gets easier. It absolutely gets easier. I wanted to go back to, there was one really fun show that we did as a family in 2012 at Kala. So the curator at the time, Lauren Davies, was putting together her last show before she moved to Cleveland, and it was called Actual Scale. And she came to me and she said, Ellen, do you and your kids, you and your family want to do a project for that? And the funny thing is we did stack blocks and do animation then too for that project. And so, it's just interesting how these threads keep keep returning and these projects keep returning. And we took a lot of pictures. The kids took a lot of pictures for the show that we printed out at COLA as well, kind of really close up of like some of their tiny objects, and then they were sort of blown up, and the show was all about scale. And it was the only time that we've like formally done a project together as a family, but it was fun to see it in gallery space. So sometimes it is nice to show work in a gallery space.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's such a great idea. I'm also, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I know there are some residencies that are like I have a former advisor from grad school who has done a couple of residencies with her kids where she actually traveled with them and they did, you know, kind of like doing the camps at Kala, right? Like where while you're in residency. Did you ever do anything like that with your kids? Or does it sounds like maybe that's a way for you to completely just focus on your creative work and leave everything else behind?
Yeah, I felt like that would be difficult for me. I don't know why. But I think those programs are really important artist residency programs that are, bring together a small group of parent artists with their kids. And Cowhouse Studios actually does a month of the parent artist residencies, and they have people who are watching the kids. So you could go with a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, and they're occupied in somewhere else, and the parents have 6 hours of studio time while the smaller kids are being watched by somebody else. And I think that's like an incredible opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine when you've, your kids are older now, but when they were younger, obviously your partner is, kind of holding down the fort. And it's funny, I've this, as I go through these interviews, I haven't really asked a lot of questions about people's partners and how that looks like. Most people sort of bring it up. So is there anything that you want to say about that? Kind of really obvious, like, because I think those kinds of residency programs would be obviously really great for single parents, or even if that's just something you just want your kids with you while you're doing a residency. But the alternative obviously is you have to find somebody to care for, to kind of hold down the fort at home. So anything that you want to say about that?
Yeah, well, it is interesting because my husband's in the sciences. He works in hydrology for the U.S. Geological Survey. And before we had kids, we did collaborate on some art projects, and which was really, really fun. And then I think when I talked about early on having children, and he would take a shift watching Sam and I would take a shift watching Sam. And it seemed like we just ran out of time then to have that like collaborative art time together. And he really went down the path of sort of fieldwork and research and science. And then I went down the path of art and arts administration. And so one thing I look forward to now that the kids are older is maybe having an opportunity to collaborate again with my husband, Chris, on certain art projects.
Yeah. I wonder if there are any like couples residencies.
No.
Or, self-imposed, right? Like that's something that I've done. I've been able to do a couple of very short, like weekends away. But same thing. My husband is creative and we don't really have time to work on creative things together, but something that I definitely look forward to.
I like that idea.
Yeah. So this is kind of my final question for you. In your Spoiler Alert radio podcast interview from 2008, you mentioned wanting to take various classes at the Crucible, which is another nonprofit here in Oakland, industrial arts kind of school. Obviously like a decent amount of time has passed since that interview, just a whole lifetime of parenting and working and making art. But have you been able to take any classes there or elsewhere?
I'm so sad to say that I have yet to take a class at the Crucible. I'll keep it on my bucket list. I have been taking strum and sing classes. I know it's not art making, but I have never had a chance to do music in my life. And I'm 55 years old. And a friend of mine said, do you want to take strum and sing at Freight and Salvage, which I think is called the Freight now in Berkeley? And I said, well, I don't really know how to sing and I don't know how to strum. And she said, well, you only need to learn 4 chords. And so I borrowed my daughter's ukulele and I started taking strum and sing. And I now know 4 or 5 chords. And it's been a really great hobby.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm sure just like the Bench Project, you will get around to taking classes at the Crucible.
Yeah, I would love to. I do take classes sometimes at COLA. I've taken letterpress or repeat pattern printing, things like that. And so I am still learning some new skills, alternative, screen printing, things like that.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like have there been at the residencies that you've done, it sounds like some of those have had some kind of learning opportunities.
Yeah, this last residency, I learned how to make molds from another artist that was there. And I did some cyanotype with another artist that was there. So I really like that like peer-to-peer learning model where somebody's
definitely
working on something and they're like, oh yeah, let's do this together.
Yeah, sounds amazing. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for talking with me, for coming on to Artisan Offices.
Becky, thank you so much. This was great.
Artisan Offices is produced and edited by me, Rebecca Bird Grigsby. Intro music is provided by Jesse Kelsey. Show notes and additional episodes can be found at artisanoffices.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast on your streaming platform of choice and leave the show a rating or review. This will help the podcast connect with even more artisan offices. Thank you so much for listening.
Do you know what those are called?
They're like at the beach,
like little ceramic animals.
Oh, like made out of shells, or
they're not made out of shells. Oh, okay. I'll have to see if I can find one.
I was going to say this is going to be a follow-up.